One father is a doctor, while the other is nothing more than a beggar. My son coldly said those words as he raised his glass during the Christmas dinner in front of 40 guests, making the entire room burst into laughter. However, when my ex-wife stood up and praised her new husband as a successful and respectable man, I simply sat there and listened in silence. Until I finally asked one single question, a question that left the entire dinner table completely speechless. Thank you so much for tuning into Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm truly thankful for every single one of you. Let me know down in the comments where in the world are you listening from right now. Please note this narrative contains fictional details designed for storytelling purposes. Any similarities to actual names or events are strictly coincidental, but the core message remains valuable. My son raised his glass at the Christmas Eve dinner table, smiled at 40 people and said, "One father was a doctor who built something real. The other one just took blood pressure readings in a small town and called it a career. One man at this table is a success. The other is a beggar." The room exploded with laughter. I am Thomas Merritt. I was 68 years old that Christmas Eve. I had spent 35 years as a community physician in Millbrook, Ohio, a town small enough that people waved at each other from opposite sides of the street and still meant it. I had delivered babies at 2 in the morning. I had sat beside dying farmers and held their hands when their families could not make it in time. I had waived fees more times than I could count because a patient could not afford a $60 office visit, and I could not afford to turn them away. None of that mattered to Ethan. My son was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of confidence that comes not from earning it, but from never being told otherwise. He stood at the head of Laura's dining room table, Laura, my ex-wife of 8 years, who had decorated every inch of that house with pine garlands and gold ribbon until it looked like something out of a catalog, and he held his wine glass the way men hold trophies. 40 guests filled the room. Extended family, neighbors, Laura's book club, friends, colleagues of her new husband, Richard Holt. Richard was 67, silver-haired, and had made his money in commercial real estate. He sat at the opposite end of the table from me, his hand resting lightly on Laura's chair, saying nothing. He had shaken my hand at the door with the careful politeness of a man who had been briefed on the situation and chosen neutrality. I had worn my navy vest that evening, the same one I wore the day I received a Community Health Recognition Award 20 years ago. A small ceremony in the Millbrook Town Hall, folding chairs, weak coffee, and a plaque that meant more to me than any paycheck I ever received. On my wrist was my father's watch, a mechanical piece old enough to have scratches on the crystal that no one would ever bother to buff out. I had worn it every day for 19 years. When Ethan finished his toast, Laura laughed the loudest. Her head tilted back, her hand pressed against her collarbone the way it always did when something delighted her. A few people near the middle of the table exchanged glances. One of Laura's cousins covered her mouth with her napkin. Someone near the window started clapping. I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. I looked down at my father's watch. The second hand moved in its slow, steady arc, indifferent to everything happening above it. I had learned somewhere in the long years of practicing medicine that the moments that hurt most are the ones that arrive not with rage, but with a terrible creeping clarity, the kind that settles in your chest like cold water and stays there. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of turkey. I chewed it slowly. It tasted like nothing. "On Thomas knows we're just having fun," Laura said to the table, still smiling, her voice carrying that particular brightness she used when she wanted to make a problem sound smaller than it was. "He has a great sense of humor." I had not spoken. I had smiled. I passed the breadbasket to the man beside me and answered a question from someone down the table about whether I was still gardening. I said yes. I said the time was doing well this year. I said it was a good season for rosemary. I ate. I listened. I watched Ethan lean back in his chair with the satisfied ease of a man who had done something he was proud of, who had landed a joke cleanly and felt the room reward him for it. 20 minutes passed. Dessert came out, 3 pies lined up on the sideboard, whipped cream in a ceramic bowl, coffee in a silver pot that Laura had inherited from her mother. An uncle of Ethan's reached across and poured himself a cup. Someone asked Richard about a property development he had recently completed. The conversation moved and shifted the way dinner conversations do, and I sat inside it like a stone sitting inside a river. Then Laura's cousin Dennis asked Ethan how business was going these days. Laura moved first. Her hand came up palm out the way a traffic officer stops a car. "Let's not talk shop tonight," she said, her voice warm and firm at once. "Ethan works himself half to death as it is." She was already rising from her chair, already lifting her glass. "I just want to say to the most hard-working, talented man I've had the privilege of raising." I set my fork down. The sound was small, a quiet click of silver against china. But Ethan heard it. I watched his eyes move to my hand, then to my face. Laura heard it too. Her glass paused halfway to its full height. The table had not gone quiet yet. People were still murmuring, still reaching for pie. But in the small triangle of space between Laura, Ethan, and me, something had shifted. Something they could feel but had not yet named. I looked at Laura. Then I looked at Ethan, and I asked one question. The question that made every smile in that room disappear. Before I tell you what I said at that table, you need to understand something about the years that came before it. I did not become a man who sat quietly through insults because I was weak. I became that man because I had spent 3.5 decades learning that the people who love you imperfectly are still in some broken way trying. I had extended that grace to Laura for 22 years of marriage. I had extended it to Ethan for 44 years of fatherhood. And somewhere along the way, grace had curdled into habit, and habit had curdled into something I no longer had a name for. The first time Ethan called my work meaningless, he was 26 years old. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Birchwood Lane, the house where I had raised him, where Caroline had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Laura had planted roses along the back fence every spring until the year she stopped planting anything. Ethan had just returned from his first business conference in Columbus, full of the particular energy that young men carry when they have been told for the first time that they are exceptional. He was talking about revenue models, about scalability, about the difference between people who built things and people who maintained them. I was listening, genuinely listening, the way fathers do when they are proud, even when they do not fully understand. Then he said it. "No offense, Dad, but what you do, it's maintenance work. You're not building anything. You patch people up and send them home. It's not a career. It's just upkeep." Laura was at the counter slicing apples. She did not put the knife down. She did not turn around. She made a small sound that could have meant anything and kept slicing. I looked at my son across the table. He was not being cruel, not intentionally. He was 26 and had just discovered a language that made the world feel organized and ranked, and he was testing it out the way young people test new tools without fully understanding what they can break. I said, "Every person I've kept alive long enough to grow old is something I built, Ethan." He nodded the way people nod when they have already stopped listening. That was the first time. It was not the last. The pattern repeated itself across years, across dinners, across phone calls that grew shorter as Ethan's business grew larger. My work became in the vocabulary of our family, a kind of background noise, something that had always been there like the hum of a refrigerator, unremarkable and easy to forget. Laura began introducing me at social events as Thomas, he's in medicine, with a tone that suggested the topic was best left there. When Ethan launched his first clinic, she threw him a dinner party with 20 guests and a catered spread. When I received a Community Health Recognition Award from the Ohio Department of Health, 35 years of documented service, a formal ceremony, a letter signed by the State Health Commissioner, Laura looked at the plaque for 3 seconds. "That's lovely, Thomas," she said. Then Ethan called from Columbus to say he had just signed a lease on a second clinic location. Laura put the plaque down on the kitchen counter next to a bowl of apple peels and picked up the phone. I stood in that kitchen for a long moment after she walked away. The plaque sat beside the apple peels, slightly crooked, the state seal catching the overhead light. My name was printed across the center in raised gold lettering. Thomas Merritt, M.D., in recognition of 35 years of distinguished community service. I straightened it. Then I picked it up and carried it to my home office and set it on the shelf above my desk, where I could see it every morning when I sat down. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that a man's worth is not measured by the applause in the room when his name is called. I had believed that genuinely for most of my adult life. My father had taught me that. He had worked as a railroad mechanic for 31 years and never once complained that the work was beneath him. He had come home every evening with grease under his fingernails and sat at the dinner table like a man who had done exactly what he set out to do. He gave me his watch the winter before he died. We were sitting on the back porch of his house in Canton, both of us wrapped in coats, sharing a thermos of coffee. He unclipped the watch from his wrist and held it out across the space between our chairs. "A man who serves others," he said, "never needs to prove his worth." I took the watch. I have worn it every day since. But here is what I did not tell my father. Because I did not yet know it myself, there is a difference between not needing to prove your worth and allowing other people to erase it. I learned that difference slowly across years in kitchens and dining rooms and phone calls where I said, "It's fine," when it was not fine, where I laughed along with comparisons that were not funny, where I made my own life smaller so that no one else had to feel uncomfortable about the size of theirs. By the time I sat at Laura's Christmas Eve table, I had been making myself smaller for a very long time. My daughter Caroline had seen it first. She called me from Portland one Sunday morning 2 years before any of this happened, her voice carrying the careful steadiness of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say. "Dad," she said, "you know you don't have to keep showing up to things that make you feel like nothing, right?" I told her I appreciated the concern. I told her family was complicated. She went quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You taught me that a person's work is an extension of who they are. So what does it mean when someone keeps calling your work nothing?" I did not have an answer for her that morning. Sitting at that Christmas Eve table 20 minutes after Ethan's toast, the heat still crawling up the back of my neck, I finally did. The watch had belonged to my father, Harold Merritt, who had worked the rail yards outside Canton, Ohio, for 31 years, without a single sick day that he did not earn. It was a Longines mechanical, nothing rare, nothing collectible by any serious standard. The kind of watch a working man bought in 1961 because it was reliable, and he needed to know what time the next shift started. The crystal had a hairline scratch across the lower left quadrant from the winter my father slipped on an icy platform and caught himself against a signal post. He never had it repaired. He said the scratch reminded him that catching yourself was still better than falling. My brother Daniel was there the afternoon my father gave it to me. Daniel was 4 years older, broad through the shoulders the way our father had been, with the same habit of going quiet when something mattered. We had driven out to Canton together that November, the year our father turned 78, the year the doctors had used words like managing and realistic expectations and quality of remaining time. Daniel had taken the passenger seat the whole drive without being asked, which was how I knew he understood that I needed something to do with my hands. We sat on the back porch with our father for most of that afternoon. The yard was bare, the oak tree stripped down to its winter skeleton, and our father wrapped in a wool blanket our mother had knitted 30 years before she passed. He talked about the rail yards. He talked about a conductor named Pete Garfield, who used to bring homemade venison jerky to share on long shifts. He talked the way old men talk when they are making sure the people they love will remember the right things. Then he unclipped the watch from his wrist. He held it toward me across the gap between our chairs, and his hand was steadier than I expected. "A man who serves others," he said, "never needs to prove his worth." I took it. I fastened it around my own wrist right there on the porch, and my father watched me do it with an expression I have never been able to fully describe, something between satisfaction and relief, the way a man looks when he has finally set down something heavy. Daniel reached over and gripped my father's hand. None of us said anything for a while, but the silence was the warm kind, the kind that does not demand to be filled. My father died 11 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in February, with Daniel and me on either side of his bed. I had worn the watch every day since. Ethan noticed it for the first time at a family dinner 3 years into his clinic venture, when he was still riding the momentum of early success, and had not yet learned that momentum is not the same thing as foundation. He was wearing a Breitling that evening, steel case, black dial, the kind of watch that announces itself before the man wearing it speaks. He looked at my wrist across the table and said, "Dad, that old thing makes you look poor. I can get you something decent for your birthday if you want." Laura looked up from her plate. She did not correct him. She went back to her food. "It was your grandfather's," I said. "I know what it was," Ethan said. "I'm just saying, when you come to the clinic events, people notice these things. It reflects on the family." I thought about my father on that porch. The wool blanket, the bare oak tree. The way he had held the watch out to me with a hand steadier than it had any right to be. "Then they're noticing the wrong things," I said. Ethan shrugged and reached for his wine glass. The conversation moved on, but I noticed that Laura filed it away the small, particular way she had of storing moments she planned to return to later. 3 weeks afterward, she mentioned at a family gathering that Thomas still wore his father's old watch, her voice carrying that delicate blend of affection and condescension that she had perfected over 22 years of marriage. People laughed softly, the way people laugh at something they recognize as a gentle joke at someone else's expense. I smiled. I passed the breadbasket. I did what I had always done. Maggie Whitfield had been my neighbor on Sycamore Drive for 11 years, and before that, she had been a community nurse at the Millbrook Clinic for 19, which meant she had worked alongside me long enough to know exactly what kind of man I was and what kind of family I had gone home to every evening. She was 72, sharp-eyed, and had the particular directness of a woman who had spent 4 decades delivering difficult news to people who needed to hear it. She stopped me one October morning as I was pulling weeds along the front garden bed. She stood at the low fence between our yards, with her coffee mug in both hands, and looked at me with an expression I had seen her use on patients before, the one that meant she had been holding something back and had decided to stop. "Thomas," she said, "your son has been telling people things about you, things that are not true." My hands went still in the dirt. A red-tailed hawk coasted overhead, riding a thermal above the tree line. I looked up at Maggie. "What kind of things?" I asked. She tightened her grip on the mug. "That you've been forgetting things, repeating yourself, that he's worried about your mind." She held my gaze steadily. "He used the word deteriorating." The hawk disappeared behind the tree line. I pulled off my gardening gloves slowly, finger by finger, and stood up. My knees ached the way they always did in October. I brushed the soil from my palms and looked down at my father's watch on my wrist, the scratch across the lower left crystal catching the pale morning light. Catching yourself, my father had said, is still better than falling. I thanked Maggie. I went inside. I set the gloves on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment, my hands flat on the cool tile, feeling something begin to solidify inside me that had been formless for a very long time. My 67th birthday fell on a Thursday in September, which meant nothing to anyone except me and eventually the hostess at Carver's Steakhouse on Route 9, who had to apologize to a man in a navy vest sitting alone at a table for 8. Ethan had called me 6 weeks before. I remember the exact date because I had just finished a morning shift, volunteering at the Millbrook Free Clinic, 3 hours of blood pressure checks and flu vaccinations for uninsured residents, the kind of work I had kept doing after retirement, because stopping felt like amputating something essential. My phone rang as I was washing my hands at the clinic sink, and Ethan's voice came through with the particular energy he used when he wanted something to feel generous. "Dad, I want to do something right for your birthday this year," he said. "Carver's Steakhouse, private dining room. I'll handle everything, invitations, the deposit, all of it. You just show up." I dried my hands on a paper towel. Through the clinic window, I could see the parking lot where 3 patients were still waiting in folding chairs someone had carried outside when the waiting room filled up. "You don't have to do that, Ethan," I said. "Yeah, I want to," he said. "You're turning 67. That matters." I believed him. That is the part I return to most even now, not the empty restaurant, not the 2 hours I spent waiting, but the specific and complete way I believed him when he said it mattered. I bought a new dress shirt for the occasion. Navy blue, pressed, the kind that requires actual ironing rather than just smoothing with your hands. I polished my shoes. I fastened my father's watch around my wrist and checked it twice in the bathroom mirror before I left the house. I drove myself to Carver's because Ethan had said he would arrange rides for the other guests, and I did not want to be a burden to anyone's logistics. The hostess was a young woman with red hair and a practiced smile. She led me to the private dining room in the back, a rectangular space with dark wood paneling, a long table set for 20 white candles, already lit down the center. It looked exactly like the kind of room where something worth celebrating happens. I sat at the head of the table and ordered a glass of water. 6:30 became 7. 7 became 7:30. The candles burned lower. The hostess came back twice, her smile growing more careful each time. She brought me a bread basket without being asked, which told me she had done this before, sat with someone waiting for people who were not coming. At 7:45, my phone buzzed on the table. A text from Ethan, "Sorry, Dad, something came up." I forgot to tell people it was canceled. Maybe next year. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the white tablecloth and looked at the 20 empty chairs arranged around that long table. The candles threw soft light across the place settings, forks aligned, glasses polished, folded napkins standing in neat peaks. Someone on the restaurant staff had done all of that careful, invisible work for a party that was never going to happen. I picked up the menu. I ordered the roasted chicken and a glass of Merlot. I ate slowly by myself at the head of a table meant for 20 people, and I did not cry because I had spent 67 years learning that certain kinds of pain do not come with tears. They come with a quiet, absolute clarity about who a person has chosen to be. The drive home took 14 minutes. I changed out of my dress shirt, hung it carefully in the closet, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while, with my hands resting on my knees. Caroline called the next morning from Portland. She had somehow found out I never asked how. "Dad." Her voice was tight the way it got when she was working to keep something controlled. "Please tell me you didn't sit there alone all night." I had a very good roasted chicken, I said. That is not funny. Her breath came sharp through the phone. Ethan told me he canceled it. He said he forgot. Dad, you drove there in your good shirt and sat there for 2 hours. That's not forgetting. That is a choice. I did not argue with her. She was right, and we both knew it. And sometimes being right about something painful does not require additional words. I'm fine, Caroline, I said. You keep saying that, she said. You've been saying that for years. And every time you say it, something worse happens, and you say it again. She was crying by then quietly, the kind of crying that happens when someone has been holding worry for so long that it finally finds a seam and pushes through. I hated that she was crying. I hated that my 67th birthday had given her something new to carry. I love you, sweetheart, I said. Go to work. I'll call you Sunday. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I did not drink and thought about the 20 empty chairs. I thought about the candles burning lower while I waited. I thought about the bread basket the hostess had brought without being asked. I did not know then what I would learn from Nora weeks later, that the same night Ethan had sent me that text he had written in the family group chat, anyone going, let me know. Already canceled. Haven't told the old man yet. He had canceled it before the evening began. He had let me dress up, drive to that restaurant, and sit alone at a table for 20 people. And he had known the entire time that no one was coming. When I finally read those words on Nora's phone, something in my chest did not break. It had already been broken for a long time. What happened instead was that the last remaining question I had about what kind of man my son had become was answered. 8 months before Christmas Eve, my son came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio case and wearing the expression of a man who has already rehearsed what he plans to say. I had been in the backyard when he arrived, cutting back the rosemary before the first frost. The air smelled sharp and clean the way Ohio air does in early April when the ground is still cold, but the sun has started meaning it again. I heard Ethan's car in the driveway, the particular sound of an expensive engine cutting off, and I pulled off my gardening gloves and went inside to wash my hands. He was standing in my kitchen when I came through the back door, the portfolio case on the table in front of him, his coat still on. He had not made coffee. He had not looked around the room the way a person does when they are visiting somewhere they feel comfortable. He was there to conduct something, and we both understood that from the moment I saw his face. I need to talk to you about an opportunity, he said. I dried my hands and sat down across from him. All right, I said. He opened the portfolio case and laid out a set of documents, projected revenue charts, a business expansion plan, lease agreements for 2 new clinic locations in Columbus and Dayton. The paperwork was thorough and professional, the kind that takes time to prepare. Numbers ran down the columns in clean alignment. Photographs of the proposed clinic spaces were paper-clipped to the back pages. The interiors bright and modern, nothing like the small Millbrook clinic where I had spent 35 years. I need $45,000, Ethan said. Short-term capital, 6 months and I'll have it back to you with interest. The new locations are already generating interest from insurers. This is a bridge loan, not a handout. I looked at the documents for a long time. I was a doctor, not a businessman, but I had managed a small practice for decades, and I understood enough about financial projections to read what was in front of me. The numbers were convincing. The lease agreements looked real. The expansion timeline was aggressive but not impossible. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing that afternoon in my kitchen, was that Ethan's clinic chain had already begun its collapse 4 months earlier. The documents he laid in front of me were not falsified in the crude sense of invented numbers. They were something more sophisticated and more deliberate real templates from real business filings, selectively assembled to present a picture of a company still moving forward when it had in fact already stopped. Under Ohio civil law, presenting misleading financial documentation to obtain a personal loan constitutes fraud regardless of the personal relationship between the parties involved. Ethan knew this. He had gone to business school. He understood exactly what he was doing. I did not know any of that. I knew only that my son was sitting across from me asking for help, and that I had spent 44 years trying to be the kind of father whose door was always open. "You're sure about the timeline?" I said. 6 months. 6 months, he said. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't certain. I looked at him across the table. He held my gaze steadily the way he always had. It was one of the things about Ethan that had always seemed like confidence, and that I was only now beginning to understand might be something else entirely. I went to my desk in the study and wrote him a check for $45,000. It represented most of what I had saved outside of my retirement account over the previous 4 years, clinic equipment I had sold when I retired, a small inheritance from my mother's estate money I had set aside carefully and slowly, the way people do when they have never had the luxury of earning more than they needed. I handed him the check. He folded it into his inside coat pocket without looking at it. "I'll have the repayment schedule drawn up by the end of the week," he said. He never sent it. That evening I called Carolyn. I told her I had lent Ethan the money, that I was confident in his plan, that it felt good to be able to help. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Dad," she said, "did you have a lawyer look at anything?" "He's my son, Caroline." Another pause. "I know he is," she said. "I just think when money is involved, even with family, you should protect yourself." "He'll pay it back," I said. "He gave me his word." She did not argue further. But before we hung up, she said, "Call me if anything feels off, okay? Anytime." 3 weeks passed. Then 6. The repayment schedule never arrived. When I asked Ethan about it by phone, he said he was finalizing the paperwork and would send it soon. When I asked again a month later, he said the Columbus lease had hit a regulatory delay and he needed another few weeks. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who has been lying long enough to do it without effort. I told myself it was a delay. I told myself these things took time. I told myself, with the particular stubbornness of a father who does not want to know what he already suspects, that my son was a man of his word. I wore my father's watch every day of those months. Every morning I fastened it around my wrist and felt the familiar weight of it, and thought about what my father had said on that porch in Canton. "A man who serves others never needs to prove his worth." I had served. I had given. I had trusted. It was not until Nora laid her phone on the table at the coffee shop on Elm Street months later and scrolled to a message Ethan had sent his mother the night he left my house with my check in his coat pocket that I finally understood what had happened in my kitchen that Tuesday afternoon. The message read, "Done." He believed everything. It was a Sunday evening in late November when I first noticed something wrong with the family photo app. I had been looking for a photograph of my father, a specific one taken at Daniel's house in the summer of 1987. The 4 of us sitting on the back porch after a cookout, my father still wearing his railroad cap, all of us squinting into the afternoon sun. I had uploaded it to the shared family album 2 years earlier when Caroline had asked me to digitize some of the old prints. I remembered doing it. I remembered the photograph loading the small spinning wheel, the confirmation that it had been saved successfully. It was not there. I scrolled back through the album slowly, the way you do when you are certain something must simply be misplaced. The photographs from my years in the house on Birchwood Lane gone. The photographs from Ethan's childhood, his first day of school, the camping trip we took to Hocking Hills when he was 9 gone. A photograph of Laura and me on our wedding day that I had included because Caroline had asked for it gone. The photographs of my retirement gathering at the Millbrook Clinic. 23 colleagues standing in the parking lot on a warm June afternoon gone. In their place were photographs of Richard Holt, Richard at a charity golf tournament, Richard and Laura at a restaurant in Columbus, Richard shaking hands with someone at what appeared to be a business function, Richard and Ethan at a baseball game, both of them grinning, both of them holding cups of beer. The album that had once held 40 years of my family's life had been reorganized around a man who had married my ex-wife 3 years ago, as though the decades before his arrival had simply not occurred. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked it up and called Nora. Nora Calloway was 38 years old, my brother Daniel's daughter, and had inherited her father's quality of going quiet when something mattered. She had grown up spending summers in Millbrook and had sat in my kitchen many times over the years, eating leftover pie and asking me questions about medicine with the genuine curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know the answers. She worked as a school librarian in Findlay now, 40 minutes north, and called me on my birthday every year without fail, which made her record considerably better than my son's. When she answered, her voice carried a careful steadiness that told me she had been expecting this call for longer than I realized. "Uncle Thomas," she said. "The family photo album," I said. "Do you know anything about that?" A pause. Not a surprised pause. A deciding pause, the kind that happens when someone has been holding something and is finally calculating whether the time has come to put it down. "Yes," she said. "I know about it." My chest tightened. Outside the kitchen window, the last light was leaving the sky over the Millbrook tree line, going from gray to the particular deep blue that comes just before full dark. A cardinal landed on the feeder I kept stocked on the back fence, pecked twice, and flew away. "How long?" I asked. "I found out in October," she said. "Uncle Thomas, there's more than just the photos. There's something I should have shown you a long time ago. And I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. And I was wrong about that." Her voice tightened. "Can we meet just the two of us? There's a group chat you've never been part of." I said yes. We agreed on the coffee shop on Elm Street 2 days from then. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Gary Sutton. Gary had come by the week before, not to the house, but to the old clinic building on Maple Street, where he had apparently gone out of habit before realizing the practice was under new management. The receptionist had given him my home address, which I had left for former patients who needed to reach me, and he had knocked on my front door on a Wednesday afternoon with a jar of his wife's apple butter and the comfortable ease of a man paying a social call. Gary was 55, a retired electrician who had been my patient for 11 years, the kind of man who remembered every doctor's appointment and forgot every birthday. He had high blood pressure and a stubborn resistance to reducing his salt intake that we had argued about pleasantly for a decade. I had always liked him. We had sat on my front porch with coffee, and the conversation had moved the way comfortable conversations do, unhurried, looping back on itself, landing on nothing in particular. Then Gary set his mug down and scratched the back of his neck. "I ran into somebody from Ethan's old office a couple weeks back," he said. "Fellow named Henderson used to handle their insurance contracts." He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who is not sure whether he is delivering news or confirming something already known. "He said the whole clinic chain went under back in May. Said there was some kind of financial situation, losses somewhere around $480,000. I figured you knew, but then Henderson mentioned Ethan hadn't been reachable, and I thought, well, maybe I ought to say something." I kept my expression steady. A doctor learns to do that to receive difficult information without letting his face become a problem the other person has to manage. "I appreciate you telling me, Gary," I said. He nodded, visibly relieved. "I hope I haven't overstepped." "You haven't," I said. We finished our coffee and he left the apple butter on my porch railing and drove away. I carried it inside and set it on the counter next to my fruit bowl and stood there in my kitchen with my hand resting on the jar and thought about the leather portfolio case, the projected revenue charts, the lease agreements for Columbus and Dayton. $480,000. The clinic chain had already been collapsing when Ethan sat across from me at this same kitchen table and asked me to help him expand it. I looked at the apple butter jar. I looked at my father's watch on my wrist. Then I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and typed Ethan's company name into the search bar. The kitchen light was the only light on in the house. I had not turned on the living room lamp or the hallway light the way I usually did in the evenings. I had simply sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the overhead light burning and started typing, because some things do not wait for a man to make himself comfortable before they demand to be known. Ethan's company had been called Merit Community Health Partners, a name I had always thought was more impressive than the operation behind it warranted, though I had never said so out loud. I typed it into the search bar and pressed enter and waited the 3 seconds it took for the results to load. The first result was a business news brief from a Columbus trade publication dated the previous May. The headline read, "Merit Community Health Partners ceases operations following internal financial review." I clicked it. The article was short, 4 paragraphs. The kind of piece that business publications run when a company folds quietly rather than spectacularly. It confirmed what Gary's contact Henderson had told him. The clinic chain had closed all 3 of its locations in May, citing what the article called unresolved financial discrepancies, totaling approximately $480,000. In Ohio, when a business dissolves under these circumstances, the state requires a formal filing with the Secretary of State's office and notification to any creditors within 30 days. The article noted that the dissolution filing had been submitted, which meant the process had been handled correctly on paper. But it also noted that former employees had reported receiving their final paychecks 2 weeks late, and that several vendors had contacted the publication about outstanding invoices. I read the article twice. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the kitchen ceiling. $480,000. The clinic had been failing for months before Ethan walked into my kitchen with his leather portfolio case and his projected revenue charts and his lease agreements for Columbus and Dayton. The business he had asked me to help expand had already stopped existing in any meaningful sense by the time he sat across from me and said with perfect steadiness that he was certain about the timeline. I thought about the check. $45,000 written in my own handwriting, handed across this same kitchen table. I thought about the way he had folded it into his inside coat pocket, without looking at it, the practiced casualness of that gesture. And I understood for the first time that the casualness had not been confidence. It had been relief. The relief of a man who has been running out of options and has finally secured one more. I opened a second tab and searched for Ethan's name directly. There were a few results, a LinkedIn profile that had not been updated since the previous April, a mention in a Chamber of Commerce newsletter from 2 years ago, a photograph from a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the Dayton location that had apparently opened and closed within 14 months. In the photograph, Ethan was smiling broadly, scissors in hand. A bright yellow ribbon stretched across the clinic entrance behind him. He looked exactly like a man on the way up. I closed the laptop. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak tree at the back of the yard, and I could hear the branches shifting against each other with the dry sound that bare winter trees make when the temperature drops. I had always found that sound companionable rather than lonely, but sitting there that night with my hands flat on the table and $45,000 somewhere in the recent past, it felt different. I thought about Laura, not with anger, not yet, but with the particular exhausted clarity that comes when you finally allow yourself to add things up that you have been keeping in separate columns for too long. Gary had said the clinic closed in May. If that was true, and the business news brief confirmed, it was then Laura had known since May. She had known when she called me in June to ask how my garden was coming along. She had known when she mentioned at Ethan's cousin's 4th of July gathering that Ethan was absolutely swamped with work. She had known all of it, every conversation, every offhand comment about how busy and successful her son was, and she had continued anyway. I got up and filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While I waited for it to boil, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The bird feeder was a dark shape against the fence. The rosemary I had cut back was a low mound along the garden border. Everything looked exactly as it always did, which struck me as faintly absurd given what I now knew was true. The kettle began to whistle. I made tea a chamomile blend. I grew myself dried and stored in glass jars on the pantry shelf, the same blend I had been making since my residency days, when a supervising physician had told me that chamomile before bed was the only prescription he had never had cause to regret. I carried the mug to the table and sat back down. My phone buzzed against the table surface. A text from Nora still on for Tuesday at Elm Street. I have something to show you. Better in person. I looked at the message for a moment. Then I typed back, I'll be there. I wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth move through my palms. The tea smelled like my garden in August, which felt like a very long time ago. I sat there in the kitchen light and thought about what I knew and what I did not yet know, and I understood that Tuesday was going to be worse than tonight and that I was going to go anyway, because a man who has spent 35 years sitting with patients through difficult news knows that the only thing harder than learning the truth is deciding in advance that you would rather not. The coffee shop on Elm Street was called Cornerstone, and it had been there since before I moved to Millbrook, which made it older than most of the relationships I had formed in this town. It was the kind of place that had not changed its interior in 20 years, and was better for it, mismatched wooden chairs, a chalkboard menu above the espresso machine, 2 ceiling fans that ran year-round, regardless of the temperature. The espresso machine hissed every few minutes like something releasing pressure it had been holding too long. I had always liked that sound. It reminded me of hospital corridors, of the particular aliveness of places where things were constantly being processed and released. Nora was already there when I arrived. She was sitting at the corner table farthest from the door, her hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched, her phone face down on the table beside it. She was wearing her winter coat still, which told me she had been there long enough to get cold, but not long enough to feel settled. When she saw me come through the door, something in her face shifted, the careful composure of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation and is now confronting the reality of actually having it. I hung my coat on the hook by the door and sat down across from her. "You look like you haven't slept," I said. "I haven't slept well since June," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, the way a wire gets when it has been pulled too tight for too long. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that it was family business, and I should stay out of it. But then I thought about you sitting in that restaurant on your birthday, and She stopped, her jaw tightened. "I should have shown you this months ago. I'm sorry, Uncle Thomas." She picked up her phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table to me. It was a group chat. The name at the top of the screen read, Merit Family Holiday Planning, which was the kind of innocuous title that obscures rather than describes. There were 14 members listed. I was not one of them. I scrolled up slowly. The earlier messages were ordinary enough, coordinating Thanksgiving logistics, discussing who was bringing what dish, a thread about whether to get a real tree or artificial for Laura's living room. Then I found the photographs. They had been taken without my knowledge. One showed me walking to my car on a cold morning in my old canvas jacket, the one with the fraying cuff I had been meaning to replace for 2 years. Another showed me at the Millbrook Farmers Market examining tomatoes wearing a wool cap pulled low. A third showed me at the free clinic talking with a patient outside the entrance, my stethoscope around my neck. Beneath each photograph were comments. Ethan had written beneath the first one, still wearing that jacket. Someone get the man a Goodwill gift card. Laura had responded with a laughing emoji. A cousin I barely knew had written, bless his heart, he really hasn't changed. There were more. I did not read all of them. I had read enough. Nora watched my face across the table. She did not look away. I handed the phone back to her. Keep going, I said. She scrolled further and turned the screen back toward me. The messages were from October. Laura had written, just a reminder, everyone, when we see Thomas at Christmas, please do not bring up anything about Ethan's work situation. He doesn't need to know the details, and it will only cause problems. Several people had responded with acknowledgement. One had written, of course. Thomas doesn't need to be involved in that. I read that sentence twice. Thomas doesn't need to be involved in that. My hands were very still on the table. A man spends 68 years learning to keep his hands still when everything inside him is moving fast. And the training holds even when you wish it would not, because stillness has become the only language you fully trust. There's more, Nora said quietly. She scrolled again. The next section was a series of messages between Laura and Ethan added to the group chat in a subthread. They showed transfers, not bank records, but screenshots of confirmation messages from a payment app, the kind that sends a notification when money moves between accounts. $6,500, then again, then again. 7 transfers across 7 months, each tagged with a brief note. May rent, June bills, July keep your head up baby, August rent, September don't stress about the utilities, October, November, $45,500 in total. While Laura was sending Ethan $45,500 across 7 months, she had told her sister at Thanksgiving that Thomas still hadn't figured out how to live responsibly on a fixed income. She had told her book club that retirement had been hard on Thomas because he had never been particularly ambitious. She had said these things, and she had meant them to land, and they had. She knew since May, I said. It was not a question. Since before May, Nora said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard. Ethan called her in April when the first clinic location started having problems. She's known the whole time, Uncle Thomas. Every single conversation. I looked down at my father's watch. The second hand moved in its steady arc. I thought about Laura's voice on the phone in June asking about my garden. I thought about the 4th of July gathering her hand on Ethan's shoulder, her voice bright with pride. How long have you known about the loan? I asked. The $45,000 I gave him in April. Nora's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall, but they were there, pressing against the edges of her composure. In September, she whispered. When I saw the message he sent her the night he left your house. He meant to send it privately, but he posted it into the subthread by mistake. It stayed there for 3 days before anyone deleted it. I had already seen it. I did not ask her to show me that message. I already knew what it said. I had read it in my mind 100 times since she had first mentioned it on the phone. Done. He believed everything. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the server had set in front of me without my noticing. It was warm and solid and real, and I held onto it the way you hold on to something when the ground beneath you has just confirmed that it is less stable than you believed. You did the right thing, I told Nora, showing me this. She shook her head. I should have done it sooner. You did it when you could, I said. That's enough. She looked at me across the table with her father's eyes. Daniel's steady, careful eyes, and I could see that she did not fully believe me yet. I hoped that someday she would. I left Cornerstone 20 minutes later and walked home through the cold. My hands were in my coat pockets, and my breath made small clouds in the November air, and my father's watch ticked against my wrist with its slow, indifferent precision. 3 pages, I was thinking. I would need no more than 3 pages. The walk from Cornerstone to my house on Sycamore Drive took 12 minutes at a normal pace, but I did not walk at a normal pace that evening. I walked slowly the way I used to walk between patient rooms on long hospital shifts when I needed the few seconds of corridor to reset before the next conversation. The November air was sharp enough to sting the back of my throat, and the streetlights along Elm Street threw long yellow rectangles across the pavement that I stepped through one after another without thinking about it. My hands were deep in my coat pockets. My father's watch pressed against the inside of my left wrist with its familiar, steady weight. I was 3 blocks from home when I saw that Maggie's front porch light was on. Maggie Whitfield kept her porch light burning until 10 o'clock every night, a habit left over from her years as a night shift nurse when coming home to a dark house had felt like arriving somewhere that was not expecting her. I knew this about her, the way long neighbors know small things about each other through accumulation rather than conversation. I also knew that her kitchen light visible through the side window meant she was still awake and almost certainly drinking the decaffeinated Earl Grey she switched to after 7 in the evening. I stopped at the low fence between our yards. She appeared at the front door before I had decided whether to knock. She had always had that quality, the particular attentiveness of someone trained to notice changes in an environment before being told about them. "I Temestian," she said. She read my face in the porch light the way a good clinician reads a patient's color and posture before asking a single question, and whatever she saw made her push the door open wider. "Come in. I just put the kettle on." Her kitchen smelled like Earl Grey and the faint cedar of the wood paneling she had installed herself the year her husband passed. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten more than a few meals over the 11 years we had been neighbors, and she set a mug in front of me without asking whether I wanted one. "Tell me what happened," she said, so I told her. Not everything, not the full accounting of the evening's revelations, but enough the group chat, the photographs taken without my knowledge, the comments beneath them, the money transfers. Maggie listened the way she had always listened, with the full weight of her attention, and without the reflexive sounds of sympathy that interrupt rather than receive. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked at me steadily. "There's something I should have told you more directly in October," she said. "I gave you a partial version because I was not sure how much you wanted to know. I think I underestimated you." "Tell me the full version now," I said. She took a breath. "It started in the summer. Barbara Hennessy from the end of the block mentioned that Ethan had spoken to her at the 4th of July gathering at Laura's. He told her you had been showing signs of memory problems, that you repeated yourself in conversations, that he was concerned about your ability to manage your finances independently." She held my gaze without flinching. "He used the word deteriorating. Barbara told Ruth Kaminsky, and Ruth told her daughter, and by August there were at least 6 or 7 people in this neighborhood who believed you were in cognitive decline. The kettle, which had been heating on the stove, began to whistle. Maggie reached over and lifted, without breaking eye contact, refilling the mugs with the steadiness of a woman who had delivered bad news in difficult rooms and knew that the delivery mattered as much as the content. "He told the Hendersons you might need to be monitored," she continued, "that the family was considering options. I believe the word he used was arrangements." I turned my mug slowly in my hands. Arrangements. The clinical euphemism for decisions made about a person, rather than with them, the kind of language that positions a man as a situation to be managed, rather than a person to be consulted. I had used that word myself in medical contexts, and I knew precisely what it implied about the person it was applied to. "How many people believed it?" I asked. "Shook enough," Maggie said, with the honesty I had always valued in her. "Mrs. Carmichael stopped asking your opinion on the neighborhood association business because she said she did not want to burden you. Pete Rafferty from the hardware store on Main, you know Pete. You've bought supplies from him for years. He told his wife he felt sorry for you because it was clear you were not quite yourself anymore." She set the kettle down firmly. "I told everyone it was a lie. I told them I had worked alongside you for 19 years and watched you diagnose conditions that 3 other physicians had missed, and that there was nothing wrong with your mind. But Thomas," her voice tightened, "not everyone listened. I thought about Pete Rafferty behind his hardware store counter, looking at me with what I had interpreted as friendliness, and was apparently something closer to pity. I thought about Mrs. Carmichael's careful way of steering conversations around my opinions lately, which I had attributed to her own increasing deafness rather than a deliberate exclusion. How did he did this? I said, to make it easier to explain away anything I might say about the loan, about the money. If I ever brought it up, there would already be a framework for dismissing it." Maggie looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has arrived at the same conclusion and is both relieved and grieved to find agreement. "That is exactly what I think," she said quietly. "And I think you should know that I have been telling anyone who will listen the truth about the kind of man you are. I will keep telling them." I looked at her 72 years old, sharp-eyed Earl Grey, going cold in her hands, telling me she had been defending my name in my own neighborhood without being asked and without telling me. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected. I pressed my lips together and looked down at my father's watch and waited for the moment to pass. "Thank you, Maggie," I said. The words came out quieter than I intended. She waved her hand once dismissively, the way she always deflected gratitude. "Don't thank me for doing what any decent person ought to do." She picked up her mug. "Now drink your tea before it gets cold, and tell me what you're going to do next." I wrapped my hands around the mug. The warmth moved through my palms and up into my wrists, and I sat in Maggie's cedar-smelling kitchen with the streetlight coming through the window, and thought about 3 pages of printed paper sitting on my home printer, and about a Christmas Eve dinner that was now 11 days away. "I'm going to go home," I said, "and I'm going to sleep, and then I'm going to get ready." I did not sleep well that night, but I did not expect to. I lay in the dark, with my hands folded on my chest, and let the information settle the way sediment settles in water, not forcing it into order, just allowing it to find its own level. By 4 in the morning, I had stopped pretending I was going to sleep, and got up, instead put on my robe, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The house was cold, in the way old houses get cold in Ohio in December, a bone-deep chill that the furnace addresses but never fully defeats. I turned the furnace up 2 degrees and stood at the kitchen window while the coffee brewed, watching the dark backyard where the frost had turned the dead grass silver. I knew what I was going to do. I had known since I walked home from Maggie's the night before, since I stood on the cold sidewalk outside Cornerstone, and felt the decision arrive not as a choice, but as a recognition, the way a diagnosis arrives when the symptoms have finally arranged themselves into a pattern too clear to misread. I was not going to expose Ethan to the world. I was not going to call relatives or post anything or attempt to burn down whatever remained of his reputation. That would have meant accepting the terms of the game Laura and Ethan had been playing. One person elevated, one person diminished the family as an audience for a competition nobody had agreed to enter. I had spent 68 years refusing to play that game, and I was not going to start at Christmas Eve dinner. But I was done protecting the lie that had made me the punchline. After the coffee was ready, I carried a mug to my desk in the study and sat down. I opened the folder of screenshots Nora had sent me, only the ones she had explicitly given me permission to keep, nothing beyond what she had offered freely. I did not take more than I had been given. That mattered to me. It had always mattered to me, the difference between what you are entitled to use and what you simply could reach if you wanted to. I printed 3 pages. The first page contained the sub-thread of payment confirmations, the 7 transfers of $6,500 each from Laura's account to Ethan's spanning May through November, totaling $45,500. Each transfer included Laura's brief accompanying note. May rent, June bills. July, keep your head up, baby. I had read those notes 3 times now, and the July one still landed differently than the others, because keep your head up, baby was the language of a mother who knew her child was drowning and had chosen to feed him air rather than teach him to swim. The second page contained the group chat message from Laura, instructing the family not to mention Ethan's work situation at Christmas. Beneath it, in the same thread, was a message from a cousin acknowledging the instruction, and below that one from an aunt who had written, "Poor Thomas, it's probably better he doesn't know anyway." I had not shown that particular message to anyone. I was showing it to myself now clearly, so that I would not walk into that dinner with any remaining illusions about who in that room had known what. The third page contained a single message. Ethan to Laura, sent the night he left my kitchen, with my $45,000 check folded into his coat pocket. Done. He believed everything. I folded the 3 pages in half and slid them into the inside breast pocket of the navy vest I had laid out the night before. The same vest I had worn the day I received my Community Health Recognition Award. The same vest I had worn on the night I sat alone at a table for 20 people at Carver's Steakhouse. It was becoming, I supposed, the vest I wore when things that mattered were happening. I sat at the desk for another few minutes with my coffee, looking at the bookshelves. 35 years of medical texts, monographs, journals, a framed photograph of my father and me on the Canton porch, taken the summer before his final winter, both of us squinting into the same afternoon sun, his watch on his wrist, mine on mine. A small ceramic pot of pencils Caroline had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, painted with the Ohio State wildflower, the large-flowered trillium. My phone rang at 8:45. Laura's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered. Thomas. Her voice was bright and organized, the voice she used when she was running logistics. I just wanted to confirm your comings tonight. Richard's brother is flying in from Atlanta and we have a full house, so I need accurate numbers for the caterer. I'll be there, I said. Wonderful. A brief pause, then the pivot I had expected. I was also wondering, do you still have that chamomile and peppermint blend you made last summer? The guests loved it at the 4th of July. It would be such a lovely touch for the dessert table. Very homemade, very charming. I looked at the jars of dried herbs on my pantry shelf. Chamomile, peppermint, lemon balm, all harvested and dried from my own garden. The work she had spent years characterizing as an old man's hobby. Yeah, I can bring some, I said. Perfect. Another pause, warmer this time. The warmth of a woman who has gotten what she wanted and is now being gracious about it. The guests will just love something authentic. You know how people appreciate the personal touch at these things. After she hung up, I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, looking at the herb jars. The career she had treated as quaint was suddenly charming when it served her table. The hands she had allowed her son to mock were now exactly the hands she needed for her dinner party. I felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite amusement. Something in between, the emotion that arrives when a pattern you have understood for years finally completes itself so perfectly that it almost seems designed. I took down the chamomile and peppermint jars. I measured the blend carefully and packed it into a small cloth bag I tied with kitchen twine. Then I went to shower and dress. The navy vest, the dress shirt. My father's watch fastened at the left wrist, the scratch on the crystal catching the bathroom light. 3 pages in the breast pocket. I was ready. Laura's house on Pemberton Road was the kind of house that knew how to perform the holidays. Every window glowed from within the warm amber light of someone who had planned the atmosphere as carefully as the menu. Pine garlands wrapped the porch railings in thick, fragrant loops, and a wreath the size of a wagon wheel hung on the front door with a burgundy ribbon tied at the bottom in a bow so perfect it could only have been done by someone who had practiced. String lights ran along the roofline in clean, even lines, the white kind, not the multicolored kind, because Laura had always believed that restraint was a form of elegance. I sat in my car in the street for a moment before getting out, not from hesitation. I want to be clear about that. I sat there because I was a man who had spent 35 years pausing at the threshold of difficult rooms, examining rooms, family consultation rooms, the particular room where you told a patient something that was going to change the rest of their life. And I had learned that the pause was not weakness. The pause was the thing that kept your hands steady once you crossed the threshold. I checked my father's watch. 6:17. I was 3 minutes early. I got out of the car, lifted the cloth bag of chamomile and peppermint from the passenger seat, and walked up the front path. Richard Holt opened the door before I reached it. He was wearing a dark green sweater and the careful expression of a man who had been briefed on the guest list and understood that some arrivals required more management than others. He extended his hand and shook mine with the firm, neutral grip of someone conducting diplomacy. "Thomas," he said, "good to see you. Come in, come in." The inside of the house hit me with warmth and noise and the layered smell of roasting meat and pine and the particular expensive candles Laura ordered from a catalog every November. 40 people filled the living and dining rooms, their voices rising and crossing in the way that large gatherings generate sound, not individual conversations, so much as a collective human hum that pressed against the walls and the ceiling and the carefully framed artwork. Laura appeared from the direction of the kitchen, moving with the directed energy of a hostess in full command of her event. She was wearing a deep red dress and pearl earrings, and she looked exactly like a woman who had spent 3 days making certain that everything would look effortless. She took the herb bag from my hands without breaking stride. "Perfect timing," she said, and glanced inside the bag briefly. "I'll have someone put this out with the dessert things." She was already turning away. "Get yourself a drink, Thomas." The bar set up in the corner. That was it. No introduction to nearby guests. No acknowledgement beyond the transaction. The thing she had needed from me had arrived, and the arrival of the man who brought it was a secondary detail. I made my way across the room toward the bar, stopping to exchange greetings with people I recognized: Laura's sister from Cincinnati, a couple from the neighborhood I had known for years, a man named Gerald, who had been Ethan's college roommate and now worked in insurance in Cleveland. Everyone was warm in the distracted way that people are warm at large parties, present enough to smile and shake hands, but not enough to actually land anywhere. I poured myself a glass of water and stood near the window that looked out over the backyard. The yard was dark, the string lights stopping at the edge of the patio, and beyond them the winter dark was absolute. I could see my own reflection faintly in the glass navy vest dress shirt, the watch on my left wrist, catching the room light. Daniel found me there. My brother moved through a room the way our father had unhurried, with the quiet assurance of a man who was not trying to be noticed, and therefore always was. He was 72 now, his hair fully white, his shoulders still broad, and he put his hand on my arm when he reached me and squeezed once in the way that meant he knew something was happening tonight, and he was placing himself accordingly. "You look like a man with a plan," he said quietly, close enough that no one else could hear. "I look like a man at a Christmas party," I said. He smiled the small particular smile he had used since childhood, when he thought I was being deliberately evasive. "You're wearing Dad's watch." "I wear it every day." "You polished it," he said. I looked down at my wrist. The crystal caught the light cleanly, the scratch across the lower left quadrant sharp and clear. He was right. I had polished it that morning with the soft cloth I kept in the nightstand drawer, something I did not do every day. "Stay close tonight," I said quietly. Daniel looked at me for a moment. With our father's eyes, the steady, unhurried attention of a man who did not need things, explained twice. He nodded once. Then he turned and surveyed the room with the easy manner of someone simply enjoying the party, and I understood that he would be exactly where I needed him, without requiring another word from me. Dinner was called at 7. The dining room table ran the full length of the room, extended with the leaf panels Laura brought out, only for large gatherings, set with the china she kept in the glass front cabinet year-round, and used twice a year at most. 40 people arranged themselves with the particular choreography of large family dinners, some seats claimed by habit, some by proximity, some by the careful social engineering of a hostess who had thought about it in advance. I found my place near the middle of the table. Ethan sat 4 chairs to my left, already talking to someone, his voice carrying that particular carrying quality that people develop when they are accustomed to being listened to. He was wearing a charcoal suit with no tie, the kind of studied casualness that takes effort to achieve, and he had not looked at me since I arrived. Laura took her place at the head nearest the kitchen. Richard sat at the opposite end. The candles were lit. The food came out. The room settled into the warm, collective noise of people eating together, and for a little while it was simply what it appeared to be, a house full of people at Christmas sharing a meal. Then Ethan picked up his dessert spoon and tapped it lightly against his wine glass. The sound cut through the room the way small, deliberate sounds do in large spaces. Heads turned, conversations paused. 40 people looked toward my son, and he rose from his chair with the comfortable ease of a man who has been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. Ethan had always known how to hold a room. I had watched him do it since he was a boy at school. Presentations at family gatherings, at the handful of professional events I had attended over the years, where he was the featured speaker. He had a quality that some people are born with, and others spend entire careers trying to acquire, the ability to make a room feel for the duration of his attention that he was speaking directly to each person in it. It was a genuine gift. I had always thought so, even now, standing on the other side of what that gift was about to be used for. He straightened his jacket with one hand. He looked down the length of the table with the unhurried ease of a man who knows he has the floor and has no intention of returning it quickly. Then he smiled, the wide-open smile that had been getting him out of trouble and into favor since he was 7 years old. "I want to say a few words," he began, "about the people at this table who make it worth sitting down to." He started with Richard. He praised Richard's business sense, his generosity, the way he had brought stability and genuine warmth into the family. Richard dipped his head with the modest pleasure of a man being publicly appreciated, and Laura reached over and touched his arm. People smiled. Someone near the far end of the table raised a glass in preview. Then Ethan turned toward his mother. He spoke about Laura the way men speak about women who have sacrificed and endured, with a reverence that lands differently when you know what the sacrifice actually cost and who paid for it. He called her the foundation of everything. He called her the person who had never stopped believing in him even when believing required something. His voice carried the practiced emotion of someone who has rehearsed sincerity until it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. Laura pressed her fingertips to her collarbone and blinked rapidly, the performance of being moved. Laura rose from her chair before Ethan had finished. She lifted her own glass and looked at Richard with the particular warmth of a woman who has found in her second chapter everything she believed her first one lacked. "And I want to add," she said, her voice carrying the full length of the table, "that this family would not be what it is today without the man sitting at the end of this table. Richard, you have given us stability, generosity, and a home worth gathering in. You are the kind of man who makes everyone around him better." She touched her glass to his, and the people nearest them raised theirs in response. Richard set his hand over hers and smiled the smile of a man who had long since learned not to take good fortune for granted. And then Ethan looked at me. The shift was subtle, a slight repositioning of his weight, a change in the quality of his smile from warm to something that carried an edge so fine most people in the room would not have recognized it as an edge at all. But I recognized it. I had been watching that particular smile for 44 years. "Of course," he said, "we have to acknowledge everyone at this table." A brief pause, perfectly timed. "My father spent 35 years in Millbrook taking blood pressure readings and handing out referrals. Noble work, I suppose, in its own quiet way." Another pause, and now the edge in his smile was visible to anyone who cared to look. "One father at this table built something that will last. The other one—" He glanced at me with the ease of a man who has rehearsed this moment. "Well, one man here is a success. The other is a beggar." He lifted his glass higher, his voice rising to carry across the full length of the room. "To the men who build legacies, and to knowing the difference." Laughter broke across the room, the kind that starts in one corner and pulls the rest of the table in before anyone has decided whether it is funny. It spread fast, the way laughter does when a room has been waiting all evening for permission to release something. 40 people, and most of them laughing, and the sound of it filling the dining room from wall to wall and pressing against the ceiling. Laura laughed the loudest. Her head tilted back, and her hand went to her collarbone again, and she laughed with the full-bodied relief of someone releasing something they had been saving up. I noticed somewhere in the noise that Daniel had gone very still. I noticed that Richard had set his wine glass down and was looking at the tablecloth. But those were small details easy to miss inside the larger sound of a room that had decided collectively that what had just happened was entertainment. Laura laughed the longest. Her head tilted back, and her hand went to her collarbone again, and she laughed with the full-bodied relief of someone releasing something they had been saving up. And I understood in that moment that the toast had not been Ethan's spontaneous performance. It had been coordinated. She had known it was coming. She had perhaps even helped shape it in the careful, collaborative way that people who share a contempt refine it together over time. I felt the heat climb the back of my neck. I looked down at my father's watch. The second hand moved in its slow, indifferent arc. I thought about my father on the Canton porch, the wool blanket, the bare oak tree, and the steady hand that had held the watch-out across the space between our chairs. I thought about 35 years of 2 a.m. house calls of patients who could not pay, of a waiting room that I had kept running because the people sitting in it needed somewhere to go. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of roasted turkey and put it in my mouth and chewed it carefully. It tasted like nothing like warm fiber, like the physical act of eating stripped of all pleasure. I swallowed. I picked up my water glass and drank. Around me, the laughter faded, the way group laughter always fades gradually, each person releasing it at a slightly different moment, until the room returned to the general hum of people who have been entertained and are ready to move on. "Thomas has always been such a good sport," Laura said to the woman beside her loudly enough to carry. "He knows we love him." I set a piece of bread on my side plate. I answered a question from the man to my right about whether I still volunteered at the free clinic. I said yes. I said the Wednesday morning sessions were particularly well attended. I said that flu season had started early this year and that the clinic was doing its best to keep up with the demand. The man nodded with the polite interest of someone who is satisfied by an answer without being particularly engaged by it. I ate. I listened. The conversation moved around me like water moving around a stone. Across the table, Daniel caught my eye for a fraction of a second. He said nothing. He did not need to. He simply held my gaze long enough to confirm that he had heard everything, that he was still exactly where he had promised to be, and that he was waiting. I glanced at the clock on the wall behind Laura's head. 7:23. 20 minutes, I told myself. Give them 20 minutes. Let the laughter settle. Let them believe the moment has passed, and they are safe inside it. Let them pour more wine and reach for more pie, and feel the satisfaction of a wound they think has closed. Then put the fork down. Before I reveal the single question that shattered the entire room and exposed the truth, comment justice or the number 1 below. So I know you're still standing with me here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Also, please note the events ahead include fictionalized elements crafted for dramatic impact and insight. If that is not what you are looking for today, you are welcome to stop watching right here. 20 minutes passed. The way time passes when you are waiting for something, slowly at first, then all at once. Dessert arrived at 7:43. 3 pies carried out from the kitchen on a rolling cart, pecan pumpkin, and a deep dish apple that smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar and the particular warmth of a house that has been cooking all day. Someone from the catering staff set a ceramic bowl of whipped cream beside them, and another placed a coffee service at the end of the sideboard. The table reorganized itself around the new arrivals, the way dinner tables do, plates, cleared dessert forks, appearing conversations shifting to accommodate the change. Laura rose from her chair to supervise the arrangement of the dessert table, which was her way of remaining in command of the room even when the formal structure of the meal had loosened. She moved with the particular efficiency of a woman who has hosted this event enough times that the choreography is instinct rather than effort. Laura's cousin Dennis, who was sitting 3 chairs to Ethan's right, leaned forward and addressed him across the noise of the room. "So, Ethan," he said with the easy curiosity of a man making dinner conversation, "how are things going with the business these days? Still expanding?" The question landed on the table like something dropped from a height. I watched Ethan's face. It happened in a fraction of a second. A tightening around the eyes, a microsecond of calculation so fast that if you had not been watching for it, you would have missed it entirely. Then the smile reasserted itself, smooth and practiced, and he opened his mouth to answer. Laura moved faster. Her hand came up from across the table, palm out, the gesture of someone redirecting traffic. "Let's not talk shop tonight," she said, her voice carrying the bright, firm authority of a woman who has been managing conversations for decades. "Ethan works himself absolutely ragged as it is. Tonight is for celebrating, not debriefing." She was already reaching for her wine glass, already rising back to her full height. In fact, She tapped the glass with one finger to draw attention. I want to make one more toast to the hardest-working, most dedicated man I have ever had the privilege of raising. To my son. Glasses went up around the table. Someone said, "Hear, hear." The moment sealed itself shut around Dennis's unanswered question, the way a wound closes over something that has not yet been removed. I set my fork down. The sound was small, a quiet, precise click of silver tines against the edge of my dessert plate. But in the particular acoustic of a large dining room where most sounds are soft and layered, a deliberate sound carries differently than an accidental one. Ethan heard it. His eyes moved to my hand, then to my face. Laura heard it. Her glass paused at 3/4 of its intended height, the toast unfinished, her eyes finding mine across the length of the table. The room had not gone quiet yet. People were still reaching for pie, still pouring coffee, still carrying the momentum of Laura's interrupted toast. But in the space between Laura and Ethan and me, something had shifted in the air, the way air shifts before a change in weather, a pressure difference that the body registers before the mind names it. I looked at Laura. I looked at Ethan. I kept my voice at a normal conversational volume because this was not a performance, and I was not interested in theater. This was a simple question that deserved a simple answer. "I have one question," I said, before we finished the toast. The conversations nearest to me began to quiet. The quiet spread outward the way quiet spreads in rooms when something in the quality of a voice signals that what is being said requires attention. "If I am the man at this table who built nothing," I said, "the one who just kept a waiting room running while better men built legacies, then perhaps someone can explain to me why every month since May, Laura has been quietly transferring $6,500 to Ethan's account to cover his rent and his debts." The room went silent, not the gradual silence of a conversation winding down. The absolute silence of 40 people receiving information simultaneously. The kind of silence that has texture and weight and fills a room the way water fills a vessel completely, leaving no space for anything else. Laura's wineglass stopped moving entirely. Her face did not collapse, she was too practiced for that, but it changed in a way that I had never seen it change before. The careful architecture of her expression losing one of its load-bearing elements and showing the stress of it. Ethan's chair scraped against the floor as he shifted his weight. His face had gone the particular pale of someone whose blood has redirected itself away from the surface, the paleness of shock rather than illness, and his jaw tightened with a visible effort that told me the smooth, practiced smile was no longer available to him. Richard set his wineglass down on the tablecloth with a small, precise movement and looked at it. Daniel, from his position 4 seats to my left, did not move at all. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on me with the steady, anchoring attention of a man who had positioned himself exactly where he meant to be. "That is," Laura started. Her voice came out higher than she intended, and she stopped and recalibrated. "That is absolutely not the appropriate $45,500. I said, still at the same conversational volume because I had not raised my voice once, and I was not going to start now. 7 months, May through November, I have the transfer records. I reached into the inside breast pocket of my navy vest. My hand was steady. I had known it would be steady because I had spent 35 years delivering difficult information to people who needed to hear it, and the steadiness was not something I had to produce. It was something I had built one difficult room at a time across decades of practice. I placed 3 folded pages on the table beside my dessert plate. The pages sat there in the candlelight, slightly creased from the breast pocket, entirely ordinary in appearance, devastating in content. Laura's voice came out sharp and high and cracking at the edges. "You are jealous. she said. You have always been jealous of what Ethan has built, and you are using this family dinner, to humiliate him because you cannot stand Laura. Daniel's voice came from 4 seats down, and it was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that does not need to be loud to stop a room. Stop. She turned toward him, her face flushed, her composure fully fractured now. Daniel, this is not your Ojuka. Laura. He said it again, the same way, the same volume. He looked at her with our father's eyes, steady and unhurried, and entirely unmoved by the heat in the room. Your son did not create this situation. You did. Both of you. The room stayed silent in a way that rooms rarely do when 40 people are in them. It was the kind of silence that has a specific quality. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have too much and cannot find the right shape for any of it. I could hear the coffee machine clicking in the kitchen. I could hear the sound of someone's chair shifting against the floor 2 seats to my right. I could hear my own breathing slow, and even the way a man breathes when he has decided that whatever happens next, he is going to be the steadiest thing in the room. Laura turned toward Daniel, her face flushed and tight. This is a family matter, she said, her voice carrying the brittle authority of someone who has lost the high ground and is trying to reclaim it through volume. You have no right to— I have every right, Daniel said. He had not moved from his chair. He had not raised his voice. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes steady and level, and there was something in his stillness that made Laura's agitation look, by contrast, like a thing that had come loose. I have sat at tables with this family for 60 years, Laura. I have watched what happens at them. I have a right to say when something is wrong. Laura pressed her lips together. Her jaw worked. Then she turned back to me. Those pages prove nothing, she said. Money transfers between a mother and her son are private family business. You had no right to access that information, and whatever you think you have. The first page, I said, shows 7 transfers of $6,500 each from your payment account to Ethan's between May and November of this year. Each transfer includes your note, May rent, June bills. I paused. July, keep your head up, baby. I let that one land for a moment, because that particular note, in Laura's own words, said everything about what she had known and when she had known it. The second page contains your message to this family group chat, instructing everyone present tonight, not to mention Ethan's work situation. Below it is a message from a family member confirming the instruction, and below that one from another member who wrote that it was probably better I didn't know anyway. Around the table, people were not eating. They were not reaching for coffee or adjusting napkins or performing any of the small social gestures that people use to manage discomfort at dinner tables. They were still and attentive in the way that people become when they understand that what they are witnessing is not a family argument, but an accounting. The third page, I said, is a message Ethan sent you the evening he left my house 8 months ago after I wrote him a check for $45,000 based on a set of business documents that represented a company that had already ceased to exist. I looked at Ethan directly. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before his eyes moved to the table. The message reads, "Done." He believed everything. Ethan's hands, which had been resting on the table, moved to his lap. Laura made a sound, not words, not quite, but the beginning of words, that did not survive the formation process. She turned toward Richard. Richard was looking at the 3 pages on the table with the expression of a man who is revising his understanding of a situation he thought he had already assessed correctly. Ethan. Richard's voice was quiet and measured. Is this accurate, Ethan said nothing for a long moment. His jaw moved. The muscle along the side of his face tightened and released. He was doing the rapid, invisible calculation of a man working out which version of events might still be salvageable and arriving, I could see at the conclusion, that none of them were. "It's more complicated than," he started. "Is the $45,000 accurate?" Richard said. Not a question this time. A clarification request delivered in the tone of a man who has built a career on not accepting evasion as an answer. Ethan looked at his hands in his lap. "Yes," he said. The word came out stripped of everything, no justification, no context, no surrounding language to soften it. The table absorbed it. I stood up. I did it slowly, the way I always stood from a chair, carefully, with the considered movement of a 68-year-old man who respected his knees. I straightened my vest. I looked down the length of the table, not at any one person in particular, but at the room as a whole, at 40 people who had laughed at a joke 40 minutes ago and were now sitting in the wreckage of the thing that joke had been built on top of. "I want to say one thing," I said. "Not for the room. For Ethan and Laura." Laura's chin came up. Ethan did not move. "See, I spent 35 years in this community," I said. "I delivered babies and sat with dying men and wrote off bills for families who could not pay them. And I did it because it was worth doing, and because the worth of a thing is not determined by whether the people at your dinner table recognize it." I reached into my vest pocket with my right hand and touched the folded pages still inside, not taking them out, just touching them, a reminder to myself of what was documented and what was real. "You do not have to respect what I did with my life. You do not have to understand it or admire it or find it impressive by whatever measure you use for those things. But you will never use me as a punchline again. At this table or any other." Laura opened her mouth. I looked at her, and something in my expression, not anger, not heat, just the absolute stillness of a man who has finished saying what he came to say, made her close it again. I picked up my father's watch from the table. I had not removed it. It was on my wrist where it always was. But the gesture of looking at it was deliberate, the same way everything in the last 20 minutes had been deliberate. 7:49. I had been in this house for 92 minutes. I reached for my jacket, which hung on the back of my chair. I put it on carefully, one arm, then the other, and smoothed the front. I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me with our father's eyes, and the small, precise nod of a man confirming that everything that needed doing had been done. I walked to the door. My footsteps on Laura's hardwood floor were the only sound in the room. I counted them without meaning, to the particular automatic accounting of a man moving through silence that has a weight to it. At the entrance to the dining room, I stopped once without turning around. "Merry Christmas," I said. Then I walked out through the front hallway, opened the door, and stepped into the cold. The cold hit me the moment I stepped off Laura's porch. Not the gradual cold of a man who has been outside long enough to adjust, but the immediate clarifying cold of December air after 92 minutes in a heated room, the kind that reaches the lungs before the coat is fully buttoned, and reminds you that the world outside continues regardless of what has just happened inside. I stood on the front path for a moment and breathed it in. The string lights along Laura's roofline were still burning their clean white lines above me. A neighbor's house across the street had a plastic Santa on the lawn, red-suited and cheerful, his arm raised in a permanent wave toward no one in particular. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, before starting the engine, my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way my father had taught me to drive on the county roads outside Canton 48 years ago. The windows fogged slightly from my breath. Through the fog, I could see the warm glow of Laura's windows, the shapes of people moving inside, the ordinary visual evidence of a party continuing without one of its guests. I started the engine and drove home. The drive took 11 minutes. I knew every turn, every traffic light, every stretch of road between Pemberton Road and Sycamore Drive. The way a man knows the geography of a place he has lived in for 30 years, not by thinking about it, but by the body's accumulated memory of having traveled it so many times that the route has become something closer to instinct than navigation. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in silence with the heater running and my father's watch ticking against my wrist, and the particular quality of quiet that comes after something large has been said and cannot be unsaid. I was 3 blocks from home when my phone began to buzz on the passenger seat. I did not look at it. I drove the remaining 3 blocks, pulled into my driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark of the garage before going inside. Then I carried the phone to the kitchen table and set it face up and looked at the screen. 14 messages in the family group text. I was not in the original group chat, the one Nora had shown me at Cornerstone, but I was apparently in a second one, a broader family thread that included more distant relatives, the kind of group that exists in most families for logistics and holiday coordination and the forwarding of photographs of people's grandchildren. The messages had begun arriving within minutes of my departure. Laura's sister from Cincinnati, Thomas, that was deeply inappropriate. There were children at that table. A cousin I had not spoken to in 4 years. Some things should be handled privately. This wasn't the place. A woman named Paulette who was married to one of Richard's nephews and had met me exactly twice. I feel so sorry for Ethan. Family should protect each other. I read each one. I did not respond to any of them. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and went to fill the kettle. While the water heated, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The bird feeder on the back fence was a dark shape against the night sky. The rosemary along the garden border was a low, silver-frosted mound in the ambient light from the neighbor's porch. Everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. The pruning shears on the potting bench, the empty clay pots stacked beside the shed door, the oak tree standing at the yard's edge with its bare winter branches. Nothing had changed. Everything was different. The kettle began to whistle. I made chamomile. Not from a store-bought bag from the jar on the pantry shelf, the dried flowers I had harvested and stored in August, the same blend I had packed into the cloth bag for Laura's dessert table that morning. I measured it into the infuser and stood at the counter while it steeped, and I thought about the fact that the hands Laura had needed for her dinner party tonight were the same hands she had spent years allowing her son to mock, and that this was not irony so much as it was simply the way things were, the way value gets used without being acknowledged, the way a thing can be necessary and dismissed at the same time. My phone buzzed again on the table. I did not look at it. I carried my tea to the kitchen table and sat down and drank it slowly in the yellow light of the overhead lamp. The apartment was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that a house has late on Christmas Eve when the rest of the world is somewhere else being festive. I had spent a number of Christmas Eves alone since the divorce, and I had made a reasonable peace with it. The quietness, the self-sufficiency, the small rituals that belonged only to me. The chamomile, the chair by the window, the book left face down on the side table where I had put it that morning. I picked the book up and tried to read. I managed 4 pages before I accepted that the words were moving through my mind without landing, and I set it back down. At 11:47, a message came through that was not from the group thread. It was from Caroline in Portland, and it said only Dad. Call me when you can. I heard. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back, I'm home. I'm all right. Call you tomorrow, sweetheart. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then I love you. You did the right thing. I set the phone down. I sat in the kitchen for another hour, finishing the tea and listening to the house settle around me, the small sounds of old wood contracting in the cold, the furnace cycling on and off, the occasional distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. At some point I realized I was not thinking about the dinner anymore. I was thinking about my father on the Canton porch, and the watch, and the particular quality of the winter light that afternoon, and what he had looked like when he held the watch out across the space between our chairs. A man who serves others never needs to prove his worth. I had served. I had not proven. And the distinction I understood sitting there in my kitchen on Christmas Eve was not a small one. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The next morning at 7:22, Nora called. Nora's voice when I answered was smaller than I had ever heard it. Not fragile, Nora was not a fragile person, and the distinction mattered. It was the smallness of someone who has been awake most of the night, carrying something heavy, and has not yet found a way to set it down. I could hear it in the first syllable of my name, the way the word came out measured and careful, like a step taken on uncertain ground. "Uncle Thomas," she said. "I heard what happened. Daniel called me last night. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee still in my robe, watching the Christmas morning light come through the window over the sink. It was the pale, flat light of an overcast December morning, the sky the particular gray that in Ohio means more cold is coming, and has not yet decided exactly when to arrive. "How are you?" I asked. A pause. "I keep thinking about the things I showed you," she said. "The chat, the transfers. I keep thinking if I had shown you sooner, maybe you would have had more time to prepare. Maybe it wouldn't have had to happen the way it did." "Nora," I said, "look at me." A brief silence while she processed that I meant it figuratively, that I was asking for her attention rather than her presence. "I'm looking," she said. "You gave me something true," I said. "The timing was yours to decide, and you decided when you were ready. That is enough. That has always been enough." She made a sound that was not quite a word, the sound of someone receiving something they have been withholding from themselves. Then her breath steadied, and when she spoke again, her voice had recovered some of its normal quality. "Daniel said you were extraordinary last night," she said. "He said you were the calmest person in the room." "Or I had 35 years of practice," I said. "When you spend enough time delivering difficult news, you learn that the news lands harder when the person delivering it is calm. Panic is contagious. So is steadiness." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I love you, Uncle Thomas." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said. "Go spend Christmas with your family. Call me next week." After we hung up, I finished my coffee and sat with the quiet of Christmas morning, which is a particular kind of quiet, the whole world seeming to have agreed for once to pause before continuing. I thought about Daniel, who had driven back to his house in Findlay the previous night, and had apparently called Nora within an hour of arriving. I thought about the way he had looked at me across the table when I stood up, the small, precise nod of a man, confirming that everything that needed doing had been done. Daniel called at 9:15. "You held it together," he said. He was not a man who used many words when a few would do. "I had good teachers," I said. He made a sound that in Daniel's vocabulary functioned as a laugh. "Dad would have been proud," he said. "Not because you confronted them, because you did it without becoming someone you weren't." We talked for 20 minutes, not about the dinner, not about Ethan or Laura, but about ordinary things. The weather in Findlay, the book he was reading, whether I was planning to drive up and see him in the new year. By the time we hung up, the flat gray light through the kitchen window had shifted slightly, the overcast thinning enough to let through a pale suggestion of sun that moved across the countertop and warmed the side of my coffee mug. Caroline called at 10:30 from Portland. She had been awake since 5, she said, which told me she had not slept well, which told me she had been carrying this since my text the night before. Tell me everything, she said. So I told her. The full version, the toast. The 20 minutes, the fork, going down the 3 pages on the table, Richard asking Ethan the direct question, Daniel's voice from 4 seats down the walk to the door, the Merry Christmas on the way out. I told it the way I tell things, without dramatizing, without editorializing, just the events in the order they occurred, and the details that seemed to matter. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Dad, she said. Her voice was thick but controlled. I want you to hear something. She paused. I have watched you absorb things from that family for years, things that would have broken other people, and I always told myself you were fine because you said you were fine, and because you kept showing up, and because that was easier than believing something harder. She stopped. I'm sorry I let myself believe that. My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together and looked at my father's watch on the table where I had placed it that morning, while I ate breakfast, a habit I had on days when I was not going anywhere of letting the watch rest beside my coffee rather than on my wrist. The light caught the scratch on the crystal. You don't have anything to apologize for, I said. I do, she said. But I also want you to know that what you did last night, it wasn't just for you. It was for every person who has ever sat at a table and been used as a measuring stick for someone else. Her voice broke slightly on the last 3 words, then steadied. I'm proud of you. I did not trust myself to say much after that. I said I loved her. I said I would call her in a few days. I said she should eat something for Christmas and not spend the day worrying about me. She said she would try. After we hung up, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table. The sun had strengthened slightly by then, the overcast beginning to break apart, in the way Ohio winter skies sometimes do on Christmas afternoon. Not warmth exactly, but light, the particular cold, clear light of a sky that has decided to stop hiding. I went outside and stood in the backyard for a few minutes with my coffee, looking at the garden. The rosemary was silver-frosted and still. The bird feeder needed filling. The oak tree stood at the yard's edge with its bare arms spread wide against the pale sky. I went inside and filled the feeder. A cardinal arrived within minutes, the same one perhaps that visited every morning, or perhaps a different one entirely. It landed on the feeder's edge, pecked 3 times with complete and uncomplicated purpose, and flew away. I went back inside. I washed my coffee mug. I dried it and set it back on the shelf. At 4:17 that afternoon, my phone buzzed on the kitchen table, a text from Ethan. I looked at it for a moment before opening it. Then I pressed the notification and read the 7 words on the screen. You could have protected me, Dad. I read Ethan's message 3 times. You could have protected me, Dad. 7 words. I sat with them long enough to understand what they were asking. Not for protection, not really, but for me to have continued absorbing the cost of his choices so that he would not have to face them. That was what protection had always meant in our family. Someone pays, someone smiles, someone passes the breadbasket and says nothing. I typed my response slowly, 1 word at a time. I spent 38 years protecting you, Ethan. It is time you learned to protect yourself. I sent it. I did not add anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Laura's message arrived 2 days later. It ran nearly 4 paragraphs, an elaborate construction of justification and deflection that cycled through several arguments before landing on the one she had always relied on. Most she had done it for my benefit. The comparisons, the dinner, the toast, the years of quiet diminishment, All of it had been designed, she wrote, to motivate me, to push me towards something more. She had only ever wanted me to reach my potential. I read it once, then I wrote back. 3 things, Laura. No comparing me to anyone at any table or in any conversation. No fabricating stories about my health or my mind to the people in this community. And no discussing my life with family members as though I am a problem that requires managing. If you want a relationship with me, these are the terms. They are not negotiable. I sent it and set the phone on the counter and went outside to water the rosemary. She did not respond that day. She did not respond the following day either. That hurt in the particular way that expected silences still manage to hurt even when you have prepared yourself for them. But it did not change anything. Pastor Jim Aldridge had served the Millbrook Community Church for 22 years, and in that time he had learned, as men in his position learn, that the worst news rarely arrives at convenient moments. He called on a Thursday morning, a week after Christmas, while I was sitting on the back porch with my coffee watching a pair of sparrows work over the bird feeder with the focused, unhurried efficiency of creatures that have no awareness of human complications. The air was cold enough to make the coffee steam in visible curls above the mug. I had been sitting there for 20 minutes, doing nothing in particular, which was something I had become better at in recent weeks. The simple practice of being somewhere without needing the moment to produce anything. When I saw Pastor Jim's name on the screen, I set the mug on the porch railing and answered. He told me about the Community Health Fund carefully, the way a good man delivers something painful directly without decoration, but with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that the person receiving the news did not ask for it and does not deserve the additional burden of having it handled badly. 9 months earlier, someone had submitted a series of withdrawal requests to the church's financial committee using what appeared to be my signature. The requests had been processed in 3 installments across 4 months. $28,000 in total removed from a fund that 31 families in Millbrook depended on for emergency medical expenses, the kind of costs that arrive without warning and cannot wait for a payment plan. The church's financial committee had conducted an internal review after a discrepancy was flagged during the annual audit. In Ohio, misappropriation of charitable funds through document forgery carries serious civil and potentially criminal consequences, depending on the amount involved and the intent demonstrated. The committee had traced the withdrawals to an external account. Ethan's name was attached to it. He is dealing with the consequences now, Pastor Jim said quietly. I thought you should know. Not to act, not to involve yourself, just to know. I looked at the sparrows on the feeder. One of them had found something particularly interesting in the lower tray and was working at it with single-minded determination, while the other waited on the fence post with what appeared to be patience, but was probably simply the absence of a better option. Thank you, Jim, I said. I appreciate you telling me. After we hung up, I stayed on the porch for a long time, not with rage. Rage would have been simpler, and I had spent enough years in examination rooms with patients receiving devastating news to know that simple emotions are rarely the ones that arrive first when something is truly serious. What I felt was something closer to grief, the particular exhausting grief of a father who has watched his son become someone unrecognizable over a long period of time so gradually that each individual change seemed survivable, until the accumulation of all of them became a person he could no longer locate the boy he had raised inside of. I thought about Ethan at 9 years old at the Hocking Hills campsite, asking me the names of the constellations, his small face turned up toward a sky so dark and clear that the Milky Way was visible from horizon to horizon. I had known the names of 7 constellations. I had invented the names of 4 others to fill the gaps, and he had believed every single one. I thought about that for a while. Then I went inside and called Carolyn. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting, that she had somehow known, in the way that daughters who pay attention know things, that today was going to be a day that required her to be reachable. I told her everything. The fund, the forgery, the $26,000. Pastor Jim's voice when he said Ethan was dealing with the consequences now. I told it the way I had told her the story of Christmas Eve, without dramatizing, without editorializing, just the sequence of events and the details that mattered. When I finished, she cried. Not the carefully controlled crying of someone managing their response, the full, unguarded crying of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has finally let it come all the way in. I listened to it without trying to stop it, or redirect it, or wrap it in reassurance it did not need. She cried, and I held the phone, and outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was doing the thing it does in Ohio in late December, when the sky finally clears after days of gray, turning everything it touches briefly, improbably golden. "Dad," she said, when the crying had quieted to something more manageable. "Are you all right, honestly?" "Honestly?" I said, "I think I might be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to come visit, in January, if that's okay." "That would make me very happy," I said. After we hung up, I made tea. I used the last of the chamomile from the August harvest. The jar was nearly empty now, which meant it was almost time to plan this year's planting. I carried the mug to the kitchen table and sat down in the yellow light of the overhead lamp, and I placed my father's watch on the table beside the mug the way I sometimes did on evenings when I wanted to look at it rather than wear it. The scratch on the crystal caught the light, the way it always did. Sharp and clear, the mark of a man who had caught himself falling on an icy platform and had chosen to remember the catching rather than the fall. A man who serves others never needs to prove his worth. I had spent 68 years serving. I had delivered babies and sat with the dying and waived fees and volunteered on Wednesday mornings and grown chamomile in a backyard garden and made tea for neighbors who needed it and driven myself to a restaurant in a navy vest on my birthday and sat alone at a table for 20 people and gotten up the next morning anyway, and again the morning after that and every morning since. I had never needed to prove any of it. The people who mattered had always known. Maggie had known. Daniel had known. Caroline had known. Nora had known. Pastor Jim, in his quiet way, had known. 31 families in Millbrook who had drawn on that community fund in moments of crisis had known in the specific and practical way that people know the value of something when they need it, and it is there. I set the watch down beside the empty mug. I looked at it for a long moment. The old Longines, the scratched crystal, the second hand, moving in its slow and patient arc. Then I stood up, rinsed the mug, dried it, and set it back on the shelf. Outside, Millbrook was quiet and cold, and exactly as it had always been. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, so was I. I am not a man who tells his story easily, but I tell this one because I believe the way I have believed in most things that matter, that silence protects the wrong people. These grandpa stories do not belong only to me. Every family has a table where someone sits smaller than they should. Every family story has a person who smiles and passes the breadbasket and says nothing year after year because they love too carefully and speak too late. I was that person for a very long time. God gave me 68 years before I finally understood what my father had known at 60. That a man's worth is not decided by the people who refuse to see it. If you see yourself in this family story, do not wait as long as I did. Do not let silence become permission. The table will not change until someone sets down their fork. These are my grandpa stories. I carry them not with shame, but with the hard-won clarity of a man who has finally stopped apologizing for the life he built. If something in this family story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel so these stories find you when you need them most, thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and meaning. If that is not what you are looking for today, that is perfectly all right. Choose what serves you. We will be here when you return.